December 21st, 1846. A thick, ghostly fog rolled across the ancient chalk hills of the South Downs, swallowing villages and farmsteads in its grey embrace. Along the winding road from London, a royal carriage made its slow, careful progress through the murk, its lanterns casting weak pools of yellow light that seemed to dissolve into nothingness mere feet from the windows. Inside sat Queen Victoria herself, just 27 years old, but already 7 years into a reign that would define an age. Beside her, Prince Albert peered through the misted glass, searching for some landmark in the featureless grey. They had been travelling for hours, and even the excitement of a royal progress was beginning to give way to the simple human desire to arrive. Then, without warning, the fog began to lift. It rose from the valley below like a theatre curtain ascending before a grand performance, revealing first the dark shapes of ancient oaks, then the silver ribbon of the River Arun winding through water meadows, and finally rising from the landscape, like something from a medieval illuminated manuscript, the unmistakable silhouette of Arundel Castle. Victoria leaned forward, her breath catching in her throat. Even for a queen who had seen Windsor and Hampton Court and the great palaces of Europe, this was a sight to stir the soul. The castle seemed to grow directly from the chalk hilltop upon which it stood, its grey stone walls the same colour as the Sussex downland, its towers piercing the winter sky like the raised fists of giants. In the fading December light, with wisps of fog still clinging to its battlements, Arendelle appeared less a building than a manifestation, something that had always existed and always would, a permanent feature of England itself. The Queen turned to Albert with shining eyes. Even her usually reserved husband allowed himself a smile of genuine appreciation. What Victoria saw that December afternoon was the culmination of nearly 8 centuries of history and decades of intensive restoration. The castle had witnessed Norman conquest and medieval civil war, had sheltered fugitive queens and defied parliamentary armies, had fallen into ruin and risen again through the determination of successive generations. Now, it stood ready to receive the most important guest in the land, its ancient walls hiding thoroughly modern comforts, its medieval appearance concealing Victorian engineering marvels of heating and plumbing. The man responsible for this transformation was Henry Howard, the 13th Duke of Norfolk, and as the royal carriage climbed the final approach to the castle gates, the Duke himself stood waiting to greet his sovereign. His preparations had been exhaustive. For months, an army of craftsmen had laboured to create accommodations worthy of a queen. The architectural firm Morant had designed furniture specifically for the royal visit, elegant pieces that combined Gothic forms with the most comfortable modern construction. A suite of 6 rooms on the 2nd floor of the southeast range had been completely remodelled, every detail considered, every possible need anticipated. But the Duke understood that he was offering Victoria more than comfortable lodgings. He was offering her something far more valuable, a connection to the deep past of English aristocracy, to the centuries of tradition that the Howard family embodied. The Howards were premier dukes of England, hereditary Earl Marshals responsible for organising coronations and state funerals, living links to a feudal world that the Industrial Revolution was rapidly transforming beyond recognition. Their castle at Arendelle was not merely old, it was foundational, part of the very bedrock of English identity. The royal visit lasted 3 days, and by all accounts it was a triumph. Victoria found the castle enchanting, its romantic atmosphere perfectly suited to her sensibilities. She and Albert explored the grounds, admired the views from the ancient towers, and participated in the entertainments their host had arranged. The Queen would later write warmly of her time at Arendelle, praising both the castle's historic grandeur and the hospitality she had received. But to understand the full significance of that December visit, to comprehend how a Norman fortress came to host a Victorian queen, we must travel back nearly 800 years, to a time when England itself was being remade by foreign conquest, and a man named Roger de Montgomery first looked upon this Sussex hilltop and saw not what was, but what could be. This is the story of Arundel Castle, one of the oldest continuously inhabited castles in all of England, a structure that has been besieged, partially destroyed, abandoned, restored and transformed across 9 centuries of unbroken history. It is a story of Norman conquerors and medieval earls, of civil war and religious persecution, of Victorian ambition and modern preservation. Most remarkably, it is the story of a single family, the Howards, Dukes of Norfolk, who have called Arendelle their home for nearly 500 years and who continue to reside there today, making them one of the longest continuous occupants of any castle in England. If this history of aristocratic survival and architectural transformation fascinates you, I encourage you to subscribe to our channel. We explore the most remarkable residences in Britain and the extraordinary families who built and maintained them across the centuries. Now, let us return to the fateful year of 1066, to a duke from Normandy who would change the course of English history forever, and to his trusted cousin who would be rewarded with the very land upon which Arundel Castle stands. The story of Arundel Castle begins not on the chalk hills of Sussex, but across the churning waters of the English Channel, in the rich farmlands of Normandy. In the late summer of 1066, William, Duke of Normandy, was preparing the most audacious military operation of the medieval age, a full-scale invasion of England to claim the crown he believed was rightfully his. The Norman fleet was assembling at the mouth of the River Dives. Hundreds of ships gathered to transport thousands of soldiers, horses, and all the equipment necessary for conquest. It was an enterprise of staggering ambition, one that would either establish William as one of the great kings of Christendom or destroy him utterly. But William faced a problem that all great leaders face when embarking on distant campaigns. He could not be in two places at once. While he crossed the Channel to conquer England, someone had to maintain order in Normandy, to ensure that opportunistic neighbours, the Counts of Anjou, the King of France, the lesser nobles who might see opportunity in their duke's absence, did not seize Norman lands while their ruler was away fighting for a foreign throne. For this crucial task, William turned to one of the men he trusted most in the world, his cousin Roger de Montgomery. The choice was not made lightly. Roger was not simply a relative, but one of the most capable administrators and military commanders in all of Normandy. Born around 1030 into a family of significant but not overwhelming importance, Roger had risen through a combination of ability, loyalty, and an advantageous marriage to become one of the most powerful men in the duchy. Roger's wife, Mabel de Belleme, was a formidable figure in her own right. The Belleme family controlled extensive lands along the southern frontier of Normandy, and their reputation for ruthlessness was legendary, even in an age that did not lack for brutal lords. Mabel herself would later be murdered by an enemy of the family, struck down by an assassin while she lay in her bed, a fate that suggests how dangerous the Norman aristocratic world could be. But in 1066, she was a living asset, her family connections strengthening Roger's position immeasurably. For decades, Roger had served William faithfully, helping to consolidate Norman power through a combination of diplomatic skill, military prowess, and administrative competence. When rebellions threatened the duchy, Roger helped to suppress them. When negotiations were needed with neighbouring powers, Roger often represented his duke. When William needed someone he could trust absolutely to protect his homeland during the greatest gamble of his life, Roger de Montgomery was the obvious, perhaps the only choice. This decision meant that Roger missed the Battle of Hastings, the defining moment of the Norman conquest, the day that would reshape English history for 1,000 years. On October 14, 1066, while William fought his way through the ranks of King Harold's army on Senlac Hill, while the fate of England hung in the balance, Roger de Montgomery was hundreds of miles away, maintaining order in a duchy whose duke might never return. It was a sacrifice of glory, a renunciation of the chance to stand beside William at the moment of his greatest triumph. Some men might have resented being left behind, while others won renown and plunder on foreign fields. The Norman aristocracy was nothing if not competitive, and the rewards being distributed to those who fought at Hastings were staggering. Entire English counties granted to men who had risked their lives beside their duke. Roger, however, understood something that more hot-headed nobles might have missed. William the Conqueror did not forget those who served him, and Roger de Montgomery had demonstrated the highest form of loyalty, placing duty above personal ambition, serving his lord's true interests rather than his own desire for glory. The reward, when it finally came, was staggering in its generosity. In late 1067, with England largely secured and the immediate crises of the conquest addressed, Roger finally crossed the English Channel to join William in his newly conquered kingdom. What he found was a realm in chaos, with English resistance simmering in every corner, requiring strong Norman lords to establish order and defend against rebellion. The English might have lost at Hastings, but they had not accepted their defeat. Across the country, from the Welsh marches to the Scottish border, English nobles were gathering forces, plotting uprisings, hoping that what the Normans had won in a single day might yet be lost through determined resistance. William needed men like Roger, proven administrators who could impose Norman rule on hostile territories while also possessing the military capability to crush any opposition. The king's grants to his faithful cousin reflected both the scale of the task and the depth of William's trust. Roger received vast estates scattered across England, but the most significant concentration lay in Sussex, where Roger was granted approximately 1/5 of the entire county, an enormous territory known as the Rape of Arendelle. The term rape, which might startle modern ears, derived from an Old English word meaning rope, a reference to the method of measuring land by ropes of standard length. Sussex was divided into 6 such rapes, administrative districts, that extended from the coast northward into the heavily forested Weald. Each rape was granted to a trusted Norman lord who was expected to defend the coast against potential invasion, maintain order among the English population, and provide military service to the crown when required. There was, however, something appropriately violent about the term given how the Normans had obtained these territories. The English inhabitants of the Rape of Arendelle had not chosen Norman rule, and many would resist it, openly or covertly, for generations to come. The Rape of Arendelle was a substantial prize. It stretched from the coast near the modern town of Littlehampton northward into the Weald, encompassing thousands of acres of prime farmland, ancient forests, and the tidal marshes of the River Arun. At the centre of this territory, commanding a strategic position where the river cut through the South Downs, sat a prominent chalk hill that Roger immediately recognised as the perfect site for a castle. The location had everything a Norman military engineer could desire. The chalk spur rose steeply from the river valley, providing natural defensive advantages that would complement any fortifications Roger might build. The River Arun flowed past the hill's eastern flank, serving as a natural moat that enemies would struggle to cross under fire. From the hilltop, one could see for miles in every direction, watching for approaching threats and demonstrating Norman power to the subjugated English population below, and the river itself was navigable, connecting the castle to the sea and thus to Normandy, ensuring that supplies and reinforcements could reach Arendelle even if overland routes were cut by rebellion. Roger de Montgomery began construction on Arundel Castle around 1067, within months of receiving his Sussex lands. The urgency was entirely understandable. England remained restive under Norman rule, and the native population vastly outnumbered their new overlords. A strong castle served both defensive and psychological purposes, providing a secure base from which Norman authority could be projected, while simultaneously intimidating the English into submission. The message of a Norman castle was unmistakable. We are here. We intend to stay. Resistance is futile. The Normans were the master castle builders of their age, having developed techniques over generations of warfare in France. Before the conquest, England had possessed almost no castles in the continental sense. The English built fortified towns called burhs, and individual lords might have halls surrounded by ditches and palisades, but the concentrated military power of the Norman castle was something new and terrifying to English eyes. Within 20 years of Hastings, the Normans would construct hundreds of castles across England, each one a statement of permanent occupation, each one designed to ensure that the conquest could never be reversed. The original structure at Arendelle followed the classic Norman Motte-and-bailey design, a form of castle construction that the Normans had perfected and exported wherever they conquered, from the Welsh marches to southern Italy, from the Scottish border to the Holy Land. The design was elegantly simple yet remarkably effective, capable of being constructed quickly using local materials and labour, while providing formidable defensive capabilities. The heart of the Motte-and-bailey castle was the motte itself, a large artificial mound of earth that served as the castle's inner stronghold. Creating this earthwork was back-breaking labour, requiring the movement of thousands of tons of soil. At Arendelle, workers, likely a combination of Norman soldiers and English labourers conscripted for the task, toiled for months, digging soil from the surrounding area and piling it higher and higher until it formed a steep-sided hill. The motte at Arundel rose approximately 100 feet above the surrounding landscape, an impressive achievement of medieval engineering. Its sides were deliberately constructed at a steep angle, making it extremely difficult for attackers to climb while under fire from above. An enemy assault on the motte would have been a nightmarish experience. Soldiers would have to scramble up the slope, slipping on loose earth exposed to arrows, stones, javelins, and anything else the defenders chose to hurl down upon them. Even if attackers reached the summit, they would find themselves exhausted and disorganized, facing fresh defenders behind the palisade. At the top of the motte stood the keep, the castle's ultimate refuge in times of danger. In Roger's day, this would have been a wooden tower, quick to construct and effective for its purpose. The keep served multiple functions. It was the lord's residence, containing his private chambers and those of his family. It was a watchtower, allowing sentries to observe the surrounding countryside for miles. And it was the final defensive position, where the garrison could make a last stand if the bailey fell to attackers. Adjacent to the motte lay the bailey, a large enclosed courtyard that contained the practical buildings necessary for castle life. The bailey at Arendelle was substantial, reflecting both the importance of the castle and Roger's resources as one of the wealthiest lords in England. Within its protective walls stood halls for the lord and his retainers, where business was conducted and guests entertained. There were kitchens to feed the garrison, stables to house the horses essential for medieval warfare, storage facilities to hold the supplies necessary for withstanding a siege, and accommodations for the soldiers who manned the walls. The bailey was surrounded by a defensive ditch, deep and wide enough to prevent easy crossing. Beyond the ditch rose a wooden palisade, a wall of sharpened stakes that provided the first line of defence against attackers. In times of danger, people from the surrounding villages could seek refuge within the bailey's walls, bringing their livestock and valuables to safety behind the Norman defences. This was not merely charity. The villagers produced the food that fed the garrison and paid the rents that funded the lord's military establishment. Protecting them was protecting the economic foundation of Norman rule. The construction process itself revealed much about Norman methods and priorities. Speed was essential, so the Normans used readily available materials, primarily earth and timber rather than stone. Stone castles would come later, when Norman rule was more secure, and there was time for the slow, expensive process of quarrying, transporting, and fitting stone blocks. The initial Motte-and-bailey could be constructed in weeks or months, providing immediate defensive capability, while more permanent structures were planned. The workforce combined Norman expertise with English labour. The Normans brought the knowledge of castle construction, the understanding of defensive principles, the experience gained from building similar structures across France. The English provided the muscle, conscripted by their new lords to construct the very fortifications that would ensure their permanent subjugation. We can only imagine the feelings of these English workers as they toiled under Norman overseers, building the castle that would dominate their lives and their children's lives for generations to come. Roger de Montgomery's strategic vision extended beyond mere defence. The castle's position at Arendelle allowed him to control traffic on the River Arun, one of the most important waterways in Sussex. Ships sailing upriver had to pass beneath the castle's walls, subject to inspection, taxation and seizure if the lord so chose. This control over commerce was as important as military strength in establishing Norman dominance, allowing Roger to strangle any resistance by cutting off trade while enriching himself through the tolls and taxes he collected. The castle also served as an administrative centre for the Rape of Arendelle, the place where justice was dispensed, taxes collected, and the various business of lordship conducted. English peasants who had disputes with their neighbours, who owed rents or services, who needed permission to marry or to transfer land, all had to come to the castle to deal with their Norman overlords. The castle was thus woven into the fabric of daily life, a constant presence that reminded everyone, Norman and English alike, of the new order that the conquest had established. William the Conqueror recognised Roger's contributions by granting him the title Earl of Arendelle in 1067 or shortly thereafter. The earldom was one of the highest honours in the Norman kingdom, placing Roger among the handful of great lords who formed the inner circle of William's government. As Earl of Arendelle, Roger held nearly viceregal authority within his territories, dispensing justice, collecting taxes, raising troops and exercising powers that in later centuries would be reserved exclusively for the crown. The earldom came with both privileges and responsibilities. Roger was expected to maintain order throughout his Sussex lands, to suppress any English resistance, to keep the roads safe for travel and the markets open for trade. He was required to provide military forces when the king called, contributing knights and soldiers to royal armies for campaigns in England, in Wales, on the continent, wherever William's interest might take them. And he was expected to attend the royal court, to provide counsel to his king, to participate in the great decisions of state that shape the Norman kingdom. Roger de Montgomery's career reached its zenith in the years following the conquest. He fought alongside William to suppress the numerous English rebellions that flared across the kingdom in the late 1060s and early 1070s. He participated in the brutal harrying of the north in 1069-70, when Norman forces systematically devastated Yorkshire and neighbouring counties to crush resistance, destroying crops, slaughtering livestock and killing so many people that the region would not fully recover for generations. He expanded Norman power into Wales, building castles along the frontier and pushing the boundaries of English settlement westward into territories that the Welsh had held for centuries. Roger's lands in the Welsh marches made him one of the key figures in the ongoing conflict with the Welsh princes. He founded the town of Montgomery, named after his family's ancestral home in Normandy, and built a castle there to serve as a base for operations against the Welsh. His sons and grandsons would continue this expansion, creating a dynasty that controlled vast territories on both sides of the English-Welsh border. But even the greatest lords must eventually face the end that awaits all mortal men. Roger de Montgomery died in 1094, having spent his final years in religious contemplation at the abbey he had founded at Shrewsbury. Like many Norman nobles, Roger sought to atone for a lifetime of violence by generous gifts to the church, hoping that prayers offered by monks would speed his soul through purgatory and into paradise. He was buried at Shrewsbury Abbey, far from the Sussex castle where his English career had begun. Roger's death set in motion a chain of events that would bring Arundel Castle its first great crisis. His son Robert of Belleme inherited the earldom and the castle, but Robert's relationship with the crown would prove far more troubled than his father's decades of loyal service. Robert was a formidable figure in his own right, renowned throughout England and Normandy for his military skill and feared for his cruelty. Chronicles of the period paint him as a brutal lord who extracted every possible penny from his tenants and showed no mercy to those who crossed him. Such men were common enough among the Norman aristocracy, where power was maintained through force and the fear of force. But Robert of Belleme made a fatal miscalculation. In 1101, William Rufus, William the Conqueror's son and successor, was killed in a hunting accident in the New Forest, and the English throne passed to his younger brother Henry. Robert initially supported Henry's claim, but soon grew discontented with the new king's rule. In 1102, Robert joined a rebellion against Henry I, gambling that he could overthrow the king and replace him with someone more favourable to baronial interests. The gamble failed catastrophically. King Henry moved swiftly against the rebels, demonstrating the ruthless efficiency that would characterise his reign. Royal forces appeared before Arundel Castle between 1101 and 1102, and Henry himself led the siege. The castle that Roger de Montgomery had built to dominate the Sussex countryside now faced a far more formidable enemy than English rebels. The full resources of the English crown were deployed against Arendelle's walls, surrounding the fortress and cutting off any hope of relief or resupply. The siege of Arendelle demonstrated both the strength of Norman castle construction and its ultimate limitations against a determined royal assault. Medieval sieges were often decided not by direct attack but by starvation and attrition. A well-provisioned castle could hold out for months, even years, waiting for relief forces to arrive or for the besieging army to give up and go home. But if no relief came, and supplies ran out, surrender became inevitable. At Arendelle, the garrison held out as long as they could, but without hope of rescue, their resistance was ultimately futile. The castle surrendered to the king, and Robert of Belleme was stripped of his English lands and titles. He was banished from the kingdom, forbidden ever to return on pain of death, and spent the rest of his life as a landless exile, dependent on the charity of continental relatives. The Montgomery dynasty, which had seemed so secure when Roger first raised his banner over Arendelle, had lasted barely a generation after its founder's death. What happened to Robert of Belleme mattered less to the castle's long-term story than what happened to the castle itself. Rather than destroying Arendelle or granting it to a new family, Henry I retained it in royal hands, recognizing its strategic importance and unwilling to entrust such a powerful fortress to a subject who might someday use it against him. For some years, Arendelle was a royal castle, maintained by the crown and garrisoned by royal troops. But castles require lords, and Henry eventually granted Arendelle to his second wife, Adeliza of Louvain. This decision would prove fateful, linking the castle to some of the most dramatic events of 12th century English history and establishing patterns of ownership that would persist through various transformations down to the present day. Adeliza of Louvain was a figure of considerable importance in early 12th century England. Daughter of Godfrey I of Louvain, a powerful continental prince, she was renowned as one of the great beauties of her age. Contemporary chroniclers praise her loveliness, her grace, her piety, and her gentleness, the qualities that medieval men valued most in noble women. Henry I married her in 1121, and the match had clear political purposes. Henry hoped that Adeliza would provide him with a male heir, a son to succeed him, and continue the Norman dynasty in England. That hope proved tragically vain. Despite years of marriage, Adeliza bore Henry no children. The king already had one legitimate child, his daughter Matilda, but in the early 12th century the idea of a woman ruling England seemed almost unthinkable. Henry also had numerous illegitimate children, products of his legendary appetite for women, but under the laws of the time, they could not inherit the throne. As Henry aged without a legitimate male heir, the question of succession hung over his reign like a gathering storm. When Henry I died in 1135, that storm broke with devastating fury. The king had designated his daughter Matilda as his successor, forcing his nobles to swear oaths recognizing her right to the throne. But oaths sworn under compulsion are easily broken, and when news of Henry's death reached England, his nephew Stephen of Blois moved faster than anyone expected. Stephen crossed the Channel, secured the royal treasury, and had himself crowned king before Matilda could respond. The result was nearly 2 decades of civil war, a period of chaos and suffering that contemporaries called the anarchy. Adeliza, now a widow, had remarried in 1138 to William d'Aubigny, a rising nobleman who would become one of the most important figures of the Civil War era. William was a skilled politician who managed to navigate the dangerous waters between Stephen and Matilda, maintaining his position and expanding his power, while others were destroyed by the conflict. His marriage to the Dowager Queen brought him Arundel Castle and established his family's connection to a fortress that would remain in their hands for over a century. In 1139, a pivotal moment in the anarchy occurred at Arundel Castle. Empress Matilda, as she styled herself, finally arrived in England to press her claim to the throne. She landed on the south coast with a small force and made her way to Arundel, where her stepmother Adeliza and William d'Aubigny received her. The castle became, briefly but significantly, the headquarters of a rival claimant to the English throne. This was an extraordinarily dangerous position for Adeliza and William. By sheltering Matilda, they were committing what Stephen could reasonably view as treason, providing aid and comfort to his deadliest enemy. The decision may have reflected personal loyalty, Adeliza's affection for her stepdaughter, or it may have been a calculated bet that Matilda would ultimately prevail. Whatever their reasoning, Adeliza and William had placed themselves and their castle at the centre of the civil war. King Stephen responded with characteristic energy. As soon as he learned of Matilda's presence at Arendelle, he gathered his forces and marched on the castle. The fortress that Roger de Montgomery had built to dominate Sussex, that had already survived one royal siege under Henry I, now faced another. Stephen's army surrounded Arendelle, cutting off escape routes and preparing for what promised to be a lengthy and costly siege. But Stephen, for all his military courage, was not always the shrewdest politician. Rather than prosecuting the siege to its conclusion, he allowed himself to be persuaded by various advisers that it would be better to let Matilda go. The precise reasoning remains debated by historians. Some suggest that Stephen was influenced by the laws of chivalry, which discouraged violence against women. Others argue that he calculated correctly that Matilda would be more vulnerable on the road than behind Arendelle's walls. Whatever his thinking, Stephen granted Matilda safe conduct to leave the castle and travel to Bristol, where her supporters were strongest. It was a decision Stephen would regret. Far from ending the civil war, releasing Matilda from Arendelle prolonged it for years. She would go on to capture Stephen himself at the Battle of Lincoln in 1141, briefly holding him prisoner while she attempted to secure the crown. Although she never achieved stable control of England, she ensured that her son, the future Henry II, would eventually inherit the throne, founding the Plantagenet dynasty that would rule England for over 300 years. Arundel Castle, meanwhile, emerged from the crisis relatively unscathed. William d'Aubigny had somehow managed to shelter the king's enemy without permanently alienating the king himself, a feat of political balancing that testified to his considerable skills. As the Civil War ground on through the 1140s, William strengthened his position, and when Empress Matilda granted him the title Earl of Arendelle, he accepted gratefully, adding another layer of legitimacy to his hold on the castle. Adeliza of Louvain died in 1151, and William d'Aubigny followed her in 1176. The castle passed through the d'Aubigny line, descending from father to son for several generations. These were years of consolidation and improvement. The wooden structures that Roger de Montgomery had built were gradually replaced with stone, transforming Arendelle from a hastily constructed frontier fortress into a permanent stone castle, capable of withstanding the most determined attack. The process of converting a timber castle to stone was lengthy and expensive, often taking decades to complete. Stone had to be quarried, transported, and carefully fitted by skilled masons. The costs were enormous, but stone offered advantages that justified the expense. Stone walls could not be burned, a crucial consideration in an age when fire was the great destroyer of wooden fortifications. Stone was more resistant to the battering rams and siege engines that attackers might employ, and stone simply lasted longer, requiring less constant maintenance than timber structures that rotted and decayed. Under the d'Aubigny, Arendelle acquired the basic stone structure that visitors can still see today, though much modified by later construction. The keep atop the Motte was rebuilt in stone, a formidable tower that dominated the castle and the surrounding landscape. The wooden palisades around the bailey gave way to stone curtain walls, punctuated by towers from which defenders could launch flanking fire against attackers. Gates were strengthened with barbicans and drawbridges, creating multiple obstacles that any attacker would have to overcome. The d'Aubigny line continued at Arendelle until 1243, when Hugh d'Aubigny, the 5th Earl of Arendelle, died without male heirs. This was always a crisis for medieval noble families, potentially ending a dynasty and throwing property rights into confusion. In this case, the earldom and castle passed through the female line to John FitzAlan, who had married Hugh's sister. The FitzAlans would hold Arendelle for nearly 300 years, through some of the most turbulent centuries in English history. The FitzAlan period at Arendelle encompassed some of the greatest triumphs and deepest tragedies of medieval England. The Black Death arrived in 1348–49, killing perhaps a third of England's population and transforming society in ways that are still debated by historians. The 100 Years' War with France consumed resources and lives on a massive scale, with English armies campaigning across the Channel in pursuit of royal claims to the French throne. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 shook the foundations of the feudal order as common people rose against their lords in a brief but terrifying upheaval. And the Wars of the Roses, The bloody civil conflict between the houses of York and Lancaster tore England apart in the 15th century, destroying noble families and changing the very nature of kingship. Through all these upheavals, Arundel Castle endured. The FitzAlans were loyal servants of the crown, providing soldiers for royal armies, attending Parliament, serving in various offices of state. They maintained their castle, making repairs and improvements as necessary, but the core structure remained that which the D'Aubigny had built in the 12th and 13th centuries. Medieval lords expected their castles to last forever, and Arendelle, solidly constructed of good Sussex flint and limestone, seemed likely to fulfil that expectation. The architecture of the castle evolved during the FitzAlan centuries, though the changes were gradual rather than dramatic. As medieval lords' expectations for domestic comfort increased, new buildings were added within the walls. Great halls were constructed for feasting and entertaining, their hammer-beam roofs demonstrating the wealth and taste of their builders. Private chambers provided greater comfort for the lord and his family, separated from the bustle of the public spaces where business was conducted. Chapels served the spiritual needs of the household, with priests saying daily masses for the souls of the living and the dead. By the mid-16th century, the FitzAlan male line was approaching extinction. Henry FitzAlan, the 12th Earl of Arendelle, found himself without surviving sons. His daughter Mary would inherit the vast FitzAlan estates, but a woman could not hold the earldom in her own right. The solution was a marriage alliance, uniting Mary FitzAlan with a family powerful enough to maintain the Arendelle inheritance and prestigious enough to be worthy of it. The family chosen was the Howards, already among the most powerful in Tudor England. In 1555, Mary FitzAlan married Thomas Howard, the 4th Duke of Norfolk. It was a match that united two of the greatest noble houses in the kingdom, bringing Arundel Castle into the Howard family, where it has remained for nearly 500 years. The Howards were a family of immense power and perpetual danger. Thomas Howard, Mary's husband, was Premier Duke of England and hereditary Earl Marshal, the official responsible for organising royal ceremonies, including coronations. He was also cousin to Queen Elizabeth I through his mother, a connection to the Tudor dynasty that brought both advantages and terrible risks. In the treacherous politics of Elizabethan England, proximity to the throne was a double-edged sword, offering influence but also exposing the unwary to accusations of treason. Thomas Howard proved unequal to these dangers. He became entangled in plots to place Mary, Queen of Scots, on the English throne, hoping to marry the captive Scottish queen and eventually see her succeed the childless Elizabeth. It was a scheme that might have worked had it remained secret, but Elizabeth's spymaster, Sir Francis Walsingham, uncovered the conspiracy. In 1572, Thomas Howard, 4th Duke of Norfolk, was executed for treason, his head struck off on Tower Hill, while the queen he had served watched from a window of Whitehall. The connection between Mary, Queen of Scots, and the Howard family would create one of Arundel Castle's most precious and poignant relics. The gold rosary beads that Mary carried to her own execution in 1587 eventually came into the possession of the Howards, passed down through generations as a sacred memento of Catholic martyrdom. For a family that maintained the old faith through centuries of Protestant persecution, these beads were beyond price, tangible links to a queen who had died for the religion they shared. These irreplaceable relics remained at Arendelle for over 400 years, venerated by successive generations of Howards until May 2021, when thieves broke into the castle and stole them along with other precious objects. The theft shocked the nation and left the Howard family bereaved of treasures that no amount of money could replace. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. In the decades following the 4th Duke's execution, the Howards navigated the treacherous waters of English religious politics with varying degrees of success. As one of the leading Catholic families in a Protestant kingdom, they faced constant suspicion, occasional persecution, and the ever-present danger that their faith might cost them their lands, their freedom, or their lives. Recusancy laws imposed heavy fines on those who refused to attend Protestant services. Catholics were barred from holding public office, from attending universities, from practicing law. Several Howards served time in the Tower of London, accused of treason or Catholic sympathies that might shade into treason. Yet the family survived. They paid their fines, kept their heads down when necessary, occasionally compromised their principles to preserve their position. Some Howards converted to Protestantism, at least outwardly, to pursue careers in government or the military. Others maintained their Catholic faith regardless of the cost, accepting exclusion from public life as the price of religious integrity. Arundel Castle remained the family seat through all these troubles, though not always their primary residence. The Dukes of Norfolk controlled vast estates scattered across England, and they often preferred to spend their time elsewhere, particularly at Norfolk House in London, where they could be close to the royal court and the centres of political power. Arendelle, remote in the Sussex countryside, became something of a secondary residence, maintained but not lavishly improved. This relative neglect would have consequences when the next great crisis arrived. That crisis came in 1643, when the English Civil War reached Sussex. Like many noble families, the Howards found themselves caught in the conflict between King Charles III and Parliament. The Catholic Howards were natural royalists, their religious allegiance aligning with their political loyalty to a king who had married a Catholic queen and showed tolerance toward the old faith. But supporting the losing side in a civil war carries terrible risks, as the Howards would discover. Arundel Castle's strategic position made it a military objective regardless of the family's political sympathies. The fortress commanded important roads and the River Arun, and neither side in the Civil War could afford to leave such a strong point in enemy hands. In December 1643, parliamentary forces under Sir William Waller, one of Parliament's most capable commanders, besieged Arendelle. The siege of 1643 demonstrated both the enduring strength of medieval fortifications and their ultimate vulnerability to 17th century warfare. Approximately 800 royalist soldiers held the castle, a substantial garrison that testified to the fortress's importance. They were well supplied and well led, determined to hold Arendelle for the king against whatever Parliament might throw at them. But Sir William Waller brought something that medieval defenders had never faced: artillery capable of breaching stone walls that had withstood centuries of siege warfare. The cannons of the 1640s were far more powerful than anything previous generations had known. They could fire iron balls weighing tens of pounds with enough force to shatter masonry that had once seemed impregnable. The thick walls that had protected Arendelle through the medieval period were suddenly vulnerable, liable to crumble under sustained bombardment. For 18 days, the garrison resisted. Waller's guns pounded the walls while his infantry probed for weaknesses. Inside the castle, the defenders worked desperately to repair damage, piling earth and rubble behind breached walls, setting up secondary defences, hoping that relief might arrive before their position became untenable. But no relief came. The royalist cause in Sussex was collapsing, and there were no forces available to break Waller's siege. On December 26, 1643, the day after Christmas, the royalist garrison surrendered. The castle was battered but not destroyed, its walls breached in places but still standing. The defenders marched out with the honours of war, permitted to keep their personal weapons in recognition of their brave resistance. It was a small mercy in a war that would grow increasingly brutal as it dragged on. The aftermath of the Civil War brought further disaster to Arendelle. After King Charles II was executed in 1649 and the Commonwealth established, Parliament undertook a systematic destruction of castles that might serve as royalist strongholds in any future conflict. The policy, known as slighting, involved deliberate demolition to render fortresses untenable for military purposes. Walls were pulled down, towers toppled, gates destroyed, making it impossible for any future rebel to use the castle as a base for resistance. In 1653, Parliament ordered the slighting of Arundel Castle. The demolition was carried out, though with less thoroughness than at some other castles. Workers pulled down sections of wall, filled in defensive ditches, and generally ensured that Arendelle could no longer function as a military installation. Contemporary accounts noted that the damage was substantial but not total, and that weather caused further deterioration in the following years. Rain seeped into cracks opened by the demolition, and winter frosts widened them, slowly pulling down what Parliament's engineers had begun. For over a century, Arundel Castle remained a partial ruin. The Howards, their fortunes diminished by the Civil War and the heavy fines imposed on royalist supporters, lacked the resources for a major restoration. They continued to use what habitable portions remained, maintaining a presence at their ancestral seat, but the castle was a shadow of its former self. Visitors in the 17th and 18th centuries described a melancholy spectacle of crumbling walls and roofless chambers, a monument to both medieval power and modern destruction. Yet even in ruin, Arendelle retained a romantic appeal that would grow stronger as the decades passed. The 18th century saw the emergence of the Gothic Revival, a cultural movement that looked back to the medieval period with nostalgia and admiration. Writers and artists celebrated the picturesque qualities of ruined castles, seeing in their crumbling stones a poignant beauty that intact buildings could not match. Arendelle, with its genuine medieval core and its dramatic hilltop setting, was perfectly positioned to benefit from this shift in taste. The transformation of Arendelle from ruined fortress to restored showpiece began in 1787, when Charles Howard, the 11th Duke of Norfolk, undertook a major restoration programme. The 11th Duke was a complicated figure, known for his liberal politics, his love of drinking, and his genuine enthusiasm for architecture and improvement. He was a friend of the Prince of Wales, the future George IV, and moved in the fashionable circles of late Georgian England. But he was also deeply attached to his family's ancient seat and determined to see it restored to something approaching its former glory. The restoration work of the late 18th and early 19th centuries established the basic form of Arundel Castle that visitors see today. The 11th Duke rebuilt walls and towers that had been slighted, restored residential quarters to habitability, and added new features that combined medieval aesthetics with Georgian comfort. He understood that the castle needed to function as a modern residence, not merely a museum piece, and his improvements reflected this practical concern. Among the additions from this period was the Folly that still stands on the hill above Swanbourne Lake, a picturesque structure commissioned by the Duke and built by the architect Francis Hyorn. Follies were fashionable among Georgian aristocrats, ornamental buildings designed to enhance the beauty of landscape gardens and provide pleasing views from the main house. The Arundel Folly served both purposes, giving the Duke a destination for walks around his estate and adding a romantic focal point to the view from the castle windows. The Duke also commissioned stained glass from William Raphael Egginton, one of the foremost glass painters of the period. Egginton created windows depicting historical scenes appropriate to the castle's medieval heritage, including 3 full-length portraits of barons from the time of King John, installed in the baronial hall. These windows, which Egginton described with pride circa 1816, added colour and atmosphere to the restored interiors, helping to create the illusion of continuity with the medieval past. The 11th Duke's work continued under his successors, each generation adding its own contributions to the ongoing restoration. But the most dramatic transformation awaited the visit of Queen Victoria in 1846. Henry Howard, the 13th Duke, recognised that hosting the Queen required standards that the castle, despite decades of improvement, could not yet meet. The royal visit became the catalyst for an intensive remodelling programme that would prepare Arendelle for its greatest moment. The preparations for Victoria's visit were exhaustive in their detail. The architectural firm Morant was engaged to design furniture and fittings appropriate for a monarch's accommodation. Workers laboured for months to create the suite of 6 rooms on the 2nd floor of the southeast range, where Victoria and Albert would stay. Every aspect was considered, from the comfort of the beds to the efficiency of the heating systems, from the elegance of the draperies to the discreet placement of modern conveniences. The 13th Duke understood that he was not merely preparing guest rooms but staging a performance. The royal visit would demonstrate that the Howards, despite centuries of Catholic exclusion from full participation in English public life, remained among the premier families in the kingdom. The message was political as much as social. The Howards were loyal subjects of the crown, worthy of royal notice, integral to the fabric of English aristocratic society. Victoria's 3-day visit in December 1846 fulfilled all the Duke's hopes. The Queen found the castle enchanting, its combination of genuine antiquity and modern comfort exactly suited to her romantic sensibilities. The Victorian age worshipped the medieval past, seeing in it an idealized world of chivalry, faith, and social harmony that contrasted favourably with the industrial present. Arendelle, with its ancient walls and its aristocratic owners, seemed to embody everything the Victorians admired about the Middle Ages. But the 1846 visit also revealed that much work remained to be done. The 13th Duke's improvements, while impressive, had been somewhat hastily executed to meet the deadline of the royal visit. A truly comprehensive restoration, one that would transform Arendelle into a showpiece worthy of its history, would require decades of sustained effort and enormous expenditure. That comprehensive restoration came under the 15th Duke of Norfolk, who undertook the most ambitious building programme in the castle's history. From 1875 to 1905, an army of craftsmen laboured to transform Arendelle into a Victorian interpretation of medieval splendour. The Duke engaged Charles Alban Buckler as his architect, and the building work was carried out by the prestigious Cambridge firm of Ratty and Kett. Together, they would create the Arundel Castle that stands today, a monument to Victorian wealth, taste, and dedication to the past. Charles Alban Buckler came from a family of architects and antiquarians, steeped in the study of medieval buildings. He understood both the technical requirements of restoration work and the aesthetic principles that should guide it. His approach at Arendelle was not simply to repair what had survived, but to complete what the medieval builders had begun, creating a castle that fulfilled the potential of its original design while meeting the expectations of Victorian patrons. The work proceeded methodically over 3 decades. Buckler began with the exterior, rebuilding towers and battlements that had been destroyed or had crumbled over the centuries. He used stone carefully matched to the medieval fabric, aiming for a seamless appearance that would make it difficult to distinguish Victorian work from Norman and medieval construction. The goal was not historical accuracy in the modern sense, but rather the creation of an idealized medieval castle, one that fulfilled Victorian fantasies about what such buildings should look like. The interior transformation was even more dramatic. The Baron's Hall, one of the largest and most impressive rooms in any English castle, was rebuilt to stunning effect. Measuring 133 feet in length and 50 feet in height, the hall created a space of truly cathedral-like proportions. The ceiling featured a magnificent hammer-beam roof, a tour de force of Victorian craftsmanship that recalled the great halls of the medieval period while incorporating structural techniques unknown to earlier builders. The hammer-beam roof required the finest materials and most skilled craftsmen available. Massive oak timbers, carefully selected and seasoned, were shaped and fitted by carpenters whose skills represented centuries of accumulated knowledge. The joints were complex, designed to distribute the roof's weight while creating the soaring visual effect that the Duke and his architect desired. When completed, the Baron's Hall was one of the most impressive residential rooms in England, a space where the 19th century paid homage to the medieval past. The walls of the hall were decorated with an array of objects designed to reinforce the medieval atmosphere. Portraits of Howard ancestors lined the walls, linking the Victorian occupants to their predecessors across the centuries. Displays of armour, much of it genuine medieval work, reminded visitors of the martial traditions of the English aristocracy. Heraldic devices proclaimed the family's ancient lineage and their connections to the greatest houses of England. The chapel received particular attention, reflecting the family's Catholic faith. After centuries of persecution, Catholics could finally worship freely in England, thanks to the Catholic Emancipation Act of 1829. The Howards, who had maintained their religion through generations of discrimination, could now express their devotion openly in their ancestral home. The chapel at Arendelle became a showcase of Catholic art and devotion, with elaborate furnishings and decorations that would have been impossible just decades earlier. The chapel's design drew on medieval models while incorporating Victorian improvements. Stained glass windows, executed by leading craftsmen, filled the space with coloured light. Carved wooden furnishings, richly detailed and expertly executed, provided appropriate settings for Catholic worship. The overall effect was one of reverent beauty, a space that honoured both God and the Howard family's long tradition of faith. The picture gallery displayed the family's remarkable art collection, accumulated over centuries of patronage and collecting. Thomas Howard, the 14th Earl of Arundel, had been known in his own time as the Collector Earl, famous throughout Europe for his passion for ancient sculpture and Renaissance painting. Though much of his collection had been dispersed during the troubled years of the Civil War and Commonwealth, the family had continued to acquire artworks, and the Victorian Restoration created appropriate galleries to display these treasures. Ratty and Kett, the Cambridge firm responsible for much of the building work, brought a level of craftsmanship that matched the Duke's ambitions. Founded in 1843, the firm specialised in ecclesiastical and historic building work, with a reputation for meticulous attention to detail and mastery of traditional techniques. Their craftsmen understood how medieval builders had worked, and they could replicate those methods while incorporating modern improvements in structural engineering and materials science. The scale of the project was immense. Hundreds of workers were employed at various stages of the construction, including masons, carpenters, plasterers, painters, glaziers, and specialists in a dozen other trades. Materials came from across England and Europe, including stone from various quarries, timber from ancient forests, and decorative elements from the workshops of the finest craftsmen. The cost was correspondingly enormous, though precise figures are difficult to establish. When the work was finally completed around 1905, Arundel Castle had been transformed from a partially restored ruin into one of the most impressive noble residences in England. The 15th Duke had created a monument to his family's history, a physical declaration of Howard power and prestige that would endure for generations. The castle combined genuine medieval elements with Victorian additions so skillfully executed that casual visitors could not easily distinguish between them. The Collector Earl's legacy would be honoured in an unexpected way more than a century later. In 2008, the Collector Earl's garden was opened by Charles, then Prince of Wales, as a tribute to Thomas Howard's passion for beauty and collection. The garden, designed by Isabel and Julian Bannerman, celebrates the artistic sensibilities of the 17th century Earl while creating a thoroughly contemporary landscape experience. At the centre of the garden stands Oberon's Palace, a pavilion that features a shell-work grotto and a remarkable fountain. When the water flows, it supports a golden corona, a dancing crown that seems to float on the spray. The effect is magical, linking the earthly garden to the fairy realm of Shakespeare's Oberon. The Bannermans designed the space to evoke the wonder and delight that Thomas Howard sought in his own collecting, creating a place where visitors can experience something of the Collector Earl's passion for beauty. The gardens around Arundel Castle have always been integral to its appeal. For centuries, the grounds have been cultivated to provide both practical resources and aesthetic pleasure. But in recent years, the gardens have undergone particularly significant improvements under the direction of head gardener Martin Duncan. Duncan arrived at Arendelle in 2009 and has since transformed the castle's grounds through bold and innovative plantings. A trained horticulturalist and landscape designer, he brought fresh ideas and considerable expertise to an already distinguished garden. His work has earned recognition from horticultural authorities, culminating in the Kew Guild Medal in 2018, one of the highest honours in British gardening. Among Duncan's most acclaimed achievements is the wild water garden around the medieval friary ponds. This area, which had been somewhat neglected, has been reimagined as a romantic landscape that complements the castle's Gothic atmosphere. Native plants mingle with carefully chosen ornamentals, creating habitats for wildlife while delighting human visitors. The effect is naturalistic rather than formal, a deliberate contrast to the manicured gardens elsewhere on the estate. Country Life magazine praised Duncan and his team in April 2020, noting that they had worked wonders with their bold and innovative plantings. The gardeners and volunteers at Arendelle had created something special, a landscape that honoured the past, while embracing contemporary approaches to garden design. Their work ensured that the castle's grounds remained as impressive as its architecture. The cricket ground within the castle's park represents another aspect of Arendelle's character. Since 1895, this pitch has hosted matches ranging from local club games to fixtures involving international teams. Cricket, the quintessentially English summer sport, has become part of Arendelle's identity, connecting the medieval fortress to modern recreation. The sight of players in white against the backdrop of ancient walls has charmed generations of visitors. Arundel Castle has also served as a filming location, its authentic atmosphere attracting productions seeking genuine historic settings. In 1988, the BBC used the castle extensively for the Doctor Who serial Silver Nemesis, where it doubled for Windsor Castle. The substitution worked so well that the same trick was employed in the 1994 film The Madness of King George, again with Arendelle standing in for the principal royal residence. More recent productions have also discovered Arendelle's potential. The 2009 film The Young Victoria used the castle for several scenes, and the 2017 superhero film Wonder Woman found in Arendelle's medieval walls an appropriately dramatic setting. These productions brought the castle to audiences worldwide, introducing new generations to its remarkable architecture. The castle even appears in medieval literature, demonstrating how long Arendelle has captured the imagination. In Thomas Malory's epic Morte d'Arthur, compiled in the 15th century, Arundel Castle is identified as the home of Anglides, mother of Alessander l'Orphelin. This literary connection links the real fortress to the mythic world of King Arthur and his knights, adding another layer to Arendelle's romantic associations. History at Arendelle has not always been distant and literary. On October 14, 1651, the castle came close to playing a role in one of the most dramatic episodes of the 17th century. Charles II, the future king, was fleeing for his life after the disastrous royalist defeat at the Battle of Worcester. Hunted by parliamentary forces, he was making his way toward the coast, hoping to find a ship that would carry him to safety in France. Near Arendelle, Charles and his companion Colonel Phillips encountered a dangerous moment. Captain Morley, who held Arundel Castle for Parliament, was out hunting with his men. The two parties nearly collided, and discovery would have meant certain capture and probable execution for the fugitive prince. Charles showed the quick thinking that would characterize his years of exile, dismounting as if to descend a hill more easily and allowing Morley's party to ride past without recognizing him. It was one of many narrow escapes during Charles's remarkable flight to France. The story adds another chapter to Arendelle's connection with English royalty, though in this case the connection was adversarial. Captain Morley never knew how close he came to capturing the man who would, 9 years later, return to England as king. The 16th Duke of Norfolk had planned to give Arundel Castle to the National Trust, ensuring its preservation and opening it permanently to the public. This plan would have removed the castle from Howard family ownership for the first time since 1555, ending nearly 5 centuries of continuous occupation by the same family. It was a momentous decision, reflecting both the practical difficulties of maintaining such a vast property and the 16th Duke's commitment to making Arendelle accessible to everyone. However, the 16th Duke died in 1975 before the transfer could be completed, and his successor, the 17th Duke, cancelled the plan. The new Duke had his own vision for Arendelle's future, one that preserved the family connection while still ensuring the castle's long-term preservation. He created an independent charitable trust to guarantee the castle's future, providing a financial structure that would maintain the property regardless of the family's changing circumstances. The 17th Duke also oversaw restoration works that continued the tradition of improvement and preservation established in the Victorian era. The castle required constant attention, its vast expanses of stonework, timber and plaster demanding skilled maintenance. The Duke ensured that this work continued, preserving for future generations the legacy that so many had laboured to create. Today, Arundel Castle remains the residence of the Duke of Norfolk, while welcoming visitors who wish to experience nearly 1,000 years of English history. The castle opens to the public during much of the year, allowing tourists to walk through the Baron's Hall, admire the chapel, explore the gardens, and imagine what life was like for the various inhabitants across the centuries. It is a living house, not merely a museum, and that combination of domestic function and historic significance gives Arendelle a special character among English castles. The theft of May 2021 was a painful reminder that history's treasures remain vulnerable. When burglars broke into the castle on Friday, May 21st, They targeted some of the most precious and irreplaceable objects in the collection. The gold rosary beads carried by Mary Queen of Scots to her execution in 1587 had survived 4 centuries of Howard stewardship, surviving religious persecution, civil war, and the dangers of time itself. Their theft was not merely a property crime, but a cultural loss, removing from Arendelle objects whose historical significance far exceeded any monetary value. Also stolen were coronation cups given by monarchs to the Earl Marshal, reflecting the family's ceremonial duties at the heart of British royal tradition. For centuries, the Dukes of Norfolk have organised coronations, arranging the elaborate ceremonies that mark the accession of new sovereigns. The cups represented this heritage, tangible connections to moments when British history turned. Their loss diminished not just the Howard collection, but the nation's understanding of its own past. Yet even this crime could not diminish Arundel Castle's essential significance. The fortress that Roger de Montgomery began in 1067 has endured Norman conquest and medieval civil war, religious reformation and political revolution, Victorian restoration, and modern preservation. It has sheltered fugitive queens and welcomed reigning monarchs. It has been besieged, slighted, neglected, and transformed multiple times. Through nearly 1,000 years of English history, Arundel has witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, the transformation of society, and the remarkable persistence of one aristocratic family's connection to a single place. Standing on the castle walls today, looking out over the same landscape that Roger de Montgomery surveyed nearly 10 centuries ago, one cannot help but reflect on what Arundel represents. It is, of course, a monument to wealth and power, to the ability of great lords to shape the world according to their desires. The castle exists because powerful men wanted it to exist, and it has survived because their successors valued it enough to maintain and restore it. But Arundel is also a monument to continuity, to the human desire to connect with the past and project into the future. The Howards who live at Arundel today are descendants of people who lived there 5 centuries ago, inheritors of a tradition that stretches back to the Norman conquest and beyond. They walk the same corridors, pray in the same chapel, look out over the same valley that their ancestors knew. In a world of constant change, Arundel offers the comfort of permanence, the assurance that some things endure. The castle also testifies to the power of restoration and preservation. Left to itself after the Civil War slighting, Arundel would have become a ruin, a romantic but melancholy reminder of departed glory. Instead, successive generations invested their resources and their creativity in bringing the castle back to life. The Victorians, in particular, poured extraordinary effort into making Arundel worthy of its history, creating spaces that honoured the medieval past while meeting 19th century expectations for comfort and display. This process of preservation continues today. The gardeners who tend the grounds, the conservators who care for the artworks, the craftsmen who maintain the stonework and timber, all are links in a chain that stretches back to Roger de Montgomery's original builders. The work is never complete, for time constantly threatens what human hands have made, but the commitment to preservation ensures that Arundel will endure for future generations. As the sun sets over the South Downs and shadows lengthen across the castle's towers, one final thought suggests itself. Arundel Castle has outlasted the political systems that created it, the religious conflicts that threatened to destroy it, and the economic transformations that might have made it obsolete. It has adapted to every age while maintaining its essential identity as the seat of one of England's greatest families. In doing so, it has become more than the sum of its stones and timbers. It has become a symbol, a physical embodiment of English history itself. The Normans who built the first Motte-and-bailey would not recognise the Victorian interiors that fill the castle today. Yet they would understand the fundamental purpose of the place, a great lord's residence that commands respect through its permanence and presence. Roger de Montgomery chose this hilltop because it dominated the surrounding landscape, allowing him to project power over the Saxon population he had come to rule. Nearly 10 centuries later, Arundel still dominates its landscape, still commands attention, still projects the power of the family that calls it home. This is the true story of Arundel Castle, not merely a tale of architecture and ownership, but a meditation on time itself. The castle has witnessed nearly 1,000 years of English history, has seen kings crowned and beheaded, has survived civil wars and revolutions, has adapted to changes that would have been unimaginable to its builders. And still it endures, still it welcomes visitors, still it serves as the home of the Duke of Norfolk and his family. In a world that often seems to have lost its connection to the past, Arendelle reminds us that continuity is possible, that what our ancestors built can be preserved and handed on, that the past need not be lost. Thank you for watching this exploration of Arundel Castle's extraordinary history. If you enjoyed this journey through nearly 1,000 years of English heritage, please like, subscribe and share with others who appreciate the stories behind Britain's greatest historic houses. In the comments, let us know which aspect of Arendelle's story most surprised or moved you. Was it the drama of the Civil War siege? The romance of the Victorian Restoration? The poignant theft of Mary Queen of Scots rosary beads? We would love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, keep exploring the magnificent homes and palaces that tell the story of human ambition, achievement, and endurance.